Welcome to the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society's Director's Lecture to be given by Professor Elizabeth Anderson. I'm Jonathan Lear, and currently serving as the Roman Family Director. Anderson's question, can we talk, immediately grabs my attention. My training is in philosophy and in psychoanalysis, and I'm aware that in every Socratic conversation, as in every psychoanalytic conversation, the question of whether we can talk is always at stake. Now, the ability to talk, to say what's really on your mind, and whether you can be heard, is never straightforward, no matter what the circumstances. And one thing I've long admired about Elizabeth Anderson is her commitment to really talking about the most fundamental things: the meaning of equality, how to promote it, what is human freedom, the nature of rationality, and how are we to make sense of ourselves as creatures with a plurality of values, seeking to live meaningful lives in the company of others. These are topics philosophers have argued about for millennia, and there is a periodic tendency for discussion to become scholastic in the pejorative sense of that term, mired in minutiae of particular arguments and abstracted from the lived experience that first gave rise to them. Come on in. When I say that Elizabeth Anderson really talks, part of what I mean is that she has a sustained commitment to bringing these abstract philosophical discussions home to our lived experience, the experience of people in the 21st century living in America. Her works are brilliant philosophical inquiries, but they are at the same time practical and pragmatic efforts to expand and sustain communities in which conversation is fostered. Her classic paper, What is the Point of Equality?, shifted the conversation from unquestioned assumptions about distribution to more fundamental issues of equal relations among people. And similarly, the imperative of integration opens the landscape for living together, and I think demolishing the idea that the choices given to us by social groups who self-describe as left or right are all the choices that we have. In her most recent book, Private Government: How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It, is not only a disturbing examination of unacknowledged tyrannies within the workplace, but also a subtle historical inquiry into how the values of private property and free markets can have very different meanings in different contexts, in particular before and after the Industrial Revolution. Well, just to be clear, though, Elizabeth Anderson is a master of academic philosophical argument. Her value in Ethics and Economics, a truly path-breaking book that integrates ethics and political thought, feminist thinking, and social science research, is the most stunningly sustained critique of rational choice theory, utilitarianism, and more generally consequentialism that I have ever read. And this is really talking too. I try to teach students that if they want to disagree with a position, they have to get into the details, see what it's all about, make the best case they can for it, and only then they might get a glimpse of how and why it just won't work. Now, when it comes to this strategy, I think Elizabeth Anderson is our master teacher. And after 90 pages of working through the details of consequentialism, patiently yet relentlessly showing breakdown after breakdown, all the while showing how her expressive theory captures the phenomena so much better, she allows herself to conclude the chapter 4, with the following delightful statement, quote, "The arguments presented in the last 3 chapters do not demonstrate that consequentialism is false. With sufficient ingenuity, consequentialists may be able to refine their theory, add a few epicycles, and unleash awesome technical apparatus to repair the disadvantages of their theory, like riveters and welders patching together a rusting, leaky, but still formidable battleship stolidly defending its home waters. But why bother? A lighter, swifter, altogether more seaworthy vessel awaits those bold enough to board it en route to thus far poorly charted territories of the self, which the old battleship can reach only by awkwardly following in its wake," unquote. Elizabeth Anderson's work is admirable in its scope, ambition, purpose, and rigor, but it is also a lot of fun. And I invited Elizabeth Anderson for all these reasons. I'm thrilled that she's going to talk today about our very ability to talk. I'm sure you share my sense of urgency that this is not just a problem for the individual, but of our society. Every democracy, if it is to be viable, must struggle to promote fair and open means of communication amongst its citizens. And this ought to be a golden age. Technological achievements have opened possibilities for communication unimaginable only 1 or 2 generations ago. But for a variety of reasons, those possibilities are often constricted or shut down. Now, this is a grave problem of which I think we are all aware, and we feel somewhat stumped about what to do about it. If I understand Elizabeth Anderson's philosophy correctly, this is even a graver problem than a challenge to the established democratic social order. If we are cut off from the possibilities of dialogue, we are thereby cut off from our own possibilities for self-understanding, self-expression, and rational action. The very possibility of a meaningful life is at stake. But I will leave it to her to explain what she thinks. Elizabeth Anderson is the John Dewey Distinguished University Professor at the University of Michigan. She has made contributions to moral philosophy, political philosophy, feminist philosophy, ethics, philosophy of social science, legal philosophy, philosophy of race, and philosophy of science. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has received numerous honors, including most recently a MacArthur Fellowship this year. She is, to my mind, one of the most joyful lovers of wisdom in our midst. Please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Anderson, who will speak to us today on the subject, Can We Talk? Communicating Moral Concern in an Era of Polarized Politics.
It's a tremendous pleasure to be able to address you all here at University of Chicago, one of the great universities in the world. I'm going to start by showing you 2 illustrative cases of dysfunctional discourse in our current politically polarized age. I'm going to start with a case you might have noticed. It was reported in the Washington Post. Any number of 1,000 other cases could have been chosen, but this one I think is especially revealing for the emotions involved. A woman was preparing a picnic for her friends in a public park when a man approached her in a very aggressive and intimidating way because her t-shirt represented the flag of Puerto Rico. And he started harassing her. She was frightened by his physical intimidation and aggressive speech, asked a police officer to call this person away from this behavior. And the police officer just ignored her pleas for help. It's all caught on a cell phone video, as so many of these toxic episodes are. What I found interesting about this particular episode is he said, "You're not going to change us, you know that, right? Are you a United States citizen?" She replied that, well, all people from Puerto Rico are in fact United States citizens, and Puerto Rico is actually part of America. But he thought, no, you shouldn't be wearing that flag. What I find interesting about this particular episode is how transparent the fear is in the aggressor's voice and behavior. He's afraid that Puerto Ricans are going to change people like him, and his aggression is actually a manifestation of fear. Now, there are other modes, I think, of this kind of hostile racial discourse, and not just racial, but along all kinds of other lines of social identity, including a partisan identity, ideological identity, gender, and so forth. Things like insults and trolling. It's a popular meme you might have come across, the allegation that Michelle Obama is actually a trans woman. Or maybe you've seen the internet meme which represents Barack Obama as a former crack-addicted gay male prostitute. You're not aware of that past. Well, there's a lot of things like that. There's also problematic discourse on the left. And I think a characteristic form that it takes is shaming, especially mass shaming. Here's a very famous example from Hillary Clinton. This is a quote: "You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. They're racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And he," that is Trump, "has lifted them up. Some of these folks, they're irredeemable." This kind of discourse on both the right and the left manifests, it expresses a certain form of political polarization. If you talk to the survey researchers in America, you can distinguish polarization on the basis of issues and polarization around identities. And what the pollsters tell us about American discourse is that Americans actually are not nearly as divided in their positions over issues as they are in their opinions about members of the other party. So here you can see Republicans think Democrats are closed-minded, immoral, lazy, dishonest, and unintelligent, in that order. And Democrats think that Republicans are closed-minded, way off the charts there, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, and, well, maybe not so lazy. The picture that we get then is that Americans, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, think that the problem isn't any particular issue. It's those other people who aren't them. One way we can understand toxic political discourse in America today is that it is a manifestation or expression of what one might call positional esteem competition. And indeed, much of politics today is framed in these terms. Which group is superior? Which is more virtuous or vicious? Which group is more deserving or undeserving? There's an awful lot of moral judgments going on about whole social identities. This kind of discourse has many problematic features. Central among them is that it actually displaces the kind of evidence-based discourse that's needed for constructive problem solving. The discourse that's necessary, in other words, for democracy itself. Where we face problems together, we recognize that we and our fellow citizens share certain problems that need address and work together to construct solutions for those problems. Instead, what we get is sometimes someone will raise a concern that some behavior, for instance, is harmful on the basis of race, and the response is, "How dare you call me a racist?" And then shaming of people who behave that way. But that calls forth its own response as well, namely fear and resentment of being shamed, and a tendency of those who fear being called a racist or think they're being called a racist, they just want to walk away from it. They don't want to deal. Or maybe they'll retort say something that they regard as an equivalent insult. Or maybe they'll double down on the behavior that was just called out, insisting that there's nothing wrong with it. All of this kind of polarized, toxic discourse amounts to a failure to seek common ground as a basis for exploring solutions to the problems that we face together. And how could it possibly, if politics is framed so as to make us think that the real problem is the other side, those other groups? If the other side is the problem, then the idea of working with them to solve our problems is just not among the possibilities that are contemplated within this polarizing frame. We need to refine our diagnosis, though, in order to be able to approach a solution. So what I've articulated here is certain obstacles to communicating moral concerns to fellow citizens and denizens of America in order to orient policy to important values such as justice and public health. And I want to suggest a certain kind of diagnosis that's more refined, and that has to do with the way contemporary political discourse activates certain kinds of emotions that obstruct constructive discourse. And at this point, I want to point out that characteristic forms of toxic discourse on the right and the left differ somewhat in the emotions that they activate. On the right, it's very common to see trolling, insults, various forms of symbolic vengeance, insulting memes. And that kind of discourse expresses resentment against people on the left. Another thing that we find commonly on the right is hate speech, expressions of derogatory and insulting stereotypes, especially about various minority groups, racial minorities, LGBT people, and so forth. And that kind of discourse, I think, primarily activates and expresses fear of diverse others, mostly social groups that are less advantaged than the speaker. On the left, though, we also have toxic forms of discourse, which are most characteristically expressions of shaming and sanctimony, otherwise known as political correctness. And what these forms of discourse do is express moral contempt for people who have behaved in obnoxious ways towards various disadvantaged social groups, especially people of color. And also, though, inherently moral pride spoken on behalf of the speaker, and that's where the positional esteem competition goes. The speaker is positioning themselves as more worthy of esteem and admiration, more virtuous than the person being called out. Once we focus on the kinds of emotions that are being activated and expressed by this discourse that obstruct moving forward to collective work on solutions to our problems, that refined diagnosis enables a refined question of means. So our question then, and this is the question I'll be addressing in this talk, is how can resentment, fear, contempt, and pride be disarmed in political contexts so as to enable us to engage in constructive discourse around solving the problems we face together? That is a central question that I'm asking and attempting to answer in this talk. Let's start off in thinking about fear, how fear works and how fear can be disarmed. And here I'll take an actual example of Dr. Ayaz Virji, a Muslim doctor practicing in Minnesota, in a small town in Minnesota, and I'll tell you a little bit about his story. This is all reported in the Washington Post. When he originally arrived in this small town in Minnesota, he felt very welcome, and he was eager to serve the patients there. But during the 2016 election, he saw his neighbors, friends, patients putting up signs favoring Trump, and that aroused alarm on his part because Trump was talking about banning Muslims from entering the United States. He was talking about setting up a registry of all Muslims in the United States so the government could track them, claiming, quote, Islam hates us. In other words, Trump was mounting a campaign based on fear of Muslims, and that aroused fear in himself. He became afraid for his family. His children started getting harassed in the public schools. Peers were asking his sons whether they were carrying bombs in their backpacks to terrorize the school. And that led him to feel anger. Now, if everything had stopped with anger, there'd be not much point in investigating Dr. Virji. But he had a moment of self-reflection, and he thought, maybe I need to understand these people more before I get angry in condemnation of them. He thought, well, maybe they're ignorant, or maybe they're suffering in ways of which he's unaware. I need to be talking to these people. And he had the occasion to do so because a Lutheran pastor in town was worried about expressions of Islamophobia among her congregants and asked him to address her congregation about Islam. And so he took the opportunity to do so, and here you can see a photograph of him addressing a group of people. He went on actually ended up going on a lecture tour. So what was the talk about? Well, he did talk about what 99% of Muslims believe, that is about the content of his religion, but he didn't stop there. It was very important. I think he showed emotional wisdom in not just giving an abstract lecture about what Islam is about. He used smiles and humor. He told jokes. Do I look like a terrorist? He showed photos of his family. He's got a cat. Look, I'm a normal person. No need to be afraid. And he also explained why he came to serve in rural Minnesota. In fact, he had left a prosperous urban practice because he became aware of the fact that rural communities in America are underserved. And he thought that he would be able to do more good in one of these communities. So that's why he went there, to take care of underserved people. And he also pointed out, although it's common to assume that the worst of any group is characteristic of that group, that is a fallacy. If you say ISIS is Islam, then that's like me saying, well, Christianity is David Koresh. And finally, he spoke from the heart about the pain of being subject to negative stereotyping that he felt, that his wife felt for wearing hijab, that his sons felt in being bullied at school for their religious identity. Let's think about his address to his fellow townspeople in terms of fear and how his mode of addressing his fellows could help disarm that fear. Well, fear, of course, is a response to a perception of threat. And threat involves a perception of several subcomponents. One is a feeling that the other has power to hurt oneself. Another is some sense that the other can't be trusted. And that could involve a feeling, for instance, that the other is deceiving oneself or very secretive, feeling, oh, I don't really know what they're about. Maybe they're doing things or thinking things that are threatening to me. And finally, the sense of otherness, the sense that this person is radically different from oneself. And we can see that if that's some components of fear, some aspects of why people are afraid of others, that gives us access into how that fear might be disarmed. It could be disarmed, for instance, the power aspect could be disarmed by making oneself vulnerable before others, by showing one's vulnerability. The thought that the other is deceptive or secretive can be disarmed by manifesting sincerity and truth. And the feeling of otherness can be disarmed by showing shared identities. Dr. Virji, he's a pet owner, just like most Americans. shared concerns, making sure that the kids are getting a decent education in school. All kinds of shared concerns create a common identity, because we all have cross-cutting identities. What was the response from his fellow townspeople? Well, many of them were in tears. They didn't realize that they had hurt him and his family so much. One stood up and said, "I hear a lot of pain from you this evening, and I'm sorry." He apologized on behalf of himself and his fellow townspeople. Now, that's, of course, not the only or uniform response, but it was a powerful response, powerful enough that Dr. Virji went on a speaking tour at the encouragement of his fellows in town, who said, "You know, other people in Minnesota really need to hear from you." Here's a second emotion that I identified as highly problematic and leading to toxic discourse, is resentment. And we also know a few things about how resentment could be disarmed. I'm just going to show you one example of a more constructive way of engaging fellow citizens who feel very resentful. And this is known as analogic perspectivetaking. Here I'm drawing from important research by David Brookman and Joshua Kalia. They did an interesting experiment canvassing in Miami-Dade County in Florida about an ordinance that was being proposed to protect trans people from discrimination in employment and other areas. And the canvassing experiment was designed to offer a different way to engage others around matters of common concern. The idea was not to present the case in favor of this ordinance. It wasn't to kind of argue the other into agreeing with the canvasser. Rather, the strategy was to respectfully listen to the voter's point of view. So instead of giving a whole battery of arguments in favor of the ordinance, the canvasser instead asked the voter to explain their own position, and then carefully showed attentive listening to that person's point of view. After explaining their initial thoughts about the ordinance, the canvasser invited them to engage in analogic perspectivetaking. The canvasser asks if the voter has ever felt negative judgment because they were seen as different. So that's asking them to reflect on their own personal experience. Have they ever felt that they were treated in a negative way because they were seen as different from the rest, other people? It's a very common experience that people have for all kinds of reasons. People go back and remember how they might have been treated in a negative way in school by their peers over some difference. And they're asked to talk about that and reflect about it. They tell their story. Almost everybody has some story, recollection of when they were mistreated because they were seen as different. And then the canvasser tells a story of their own. The canvasser might actually be a trans person, in which case they identify themselves as trans and explain how they themselves have been treated poorly on account of how they've been seen differently, as different. But it's only an analogy. They don't argue. Instead, what they do is they invite the voter to reflect on now these parallel experiences and come to their own conclusion. Then the experimenters did some survey. They did a pre-canvassing survey even before the door was knocked to find out their initial view of the ordinance. And then they retested the survey several times, including up to 3 months afterwards, to see if the voters changed their minds. And indeed, what they found was analogic perspective taking led to persistently more accepting views of trans people as measured by their opinion about the merits of this ordinance. More accepting, more in favor of non-discrimination ordinances. And that lasted even 3 months after that conversation, relative to controls. So why don't we reflect a little bit about how this analogic perspective-taking exercise moved people. I think one way it did so was by disarming resentment. So a leading feature of contemporary populist discourse is resentment. It tells a story of resentment according to which elites have overlooked the virtuous middle people by favoring various minorities, poor people, marginal people, people who aren't considered real Americans, perhaps immigrants, and so forth. And one way that resentment is expressed is in terms of a sense that that elites are letting all of these other groups cut in front, to the front of the line, leaving out of consideration all of the suffering and labors that the virtuous middle has undertaken. Their concerns have been ignored. Elites are only tending to the interests of people of color or immigrants or LGBT people and so forth, but ignore all these other people who feel resentment on that account. Why should those people get special rights? Very common refrain and complaint about demands made on behalf of LGBT people. Well, that kind of resentment, we can start to disarm that kind of resentment by asking others to testify to their own experience of injustice and to respectfully listen. If the source of resentment is other people are ignoring my suffering and my troubles, well, if you respectfully listen to their suffering, their stories of suffering, their stories of trouble, that's a way to disarm that feeling that everyone's ignoring my problems. And then when one testifies to one's own experience of analogous problems or of trans friends who have suffered similarly to the voter, that analogy helps people see, well, maybe these groups aren't so different after all. Analogic perspective taking then enables people to enlarge their empathy for the targets of resentment and opens possibilities for common ground politics. Seeing oneself as not so different, alien, opposed to the other, but actually helping them see what the experience of the other is like and see parallels there. Now, this has been proved not only in experiment, but in real life, and here I speak in particular about the movement for gay marriage, which political scientists report is the fastest change in American public opinion ever measured. It's quite stunning. You can see here support for gay marriage moved from only 27% in 1996 to 67% in 2018, a stunningly rapid change in American public opinion. And we know pretty much how that came about because people in the gay rights movement had a concerted effort of coming out of the closet to their family, friends, co-workers, and so forth. These are people that had been known and trusted and loved and supported before they were out of the closet. But that collective act of coming out and testifying to how hurtful it was to have to be in the closet, was critical, I think, to enlarging the empathetic identification of straight people with the plight of gay and lesbian people, and I think was critical to changing public opinion on this matter. Now let's take a look at moral pride and contempt, which I think are the characteristic emotions that impede constructive political discourse activated by the left. So here we can see Hillary Clinton again. When they go low, you go high. She's actually quoting Michelle Obama in this case. Notice the critical move of that line. It's saying, we're morally superior. We're the morally superior people. They're doing all this lowly stuff. We're taking the high road here. That's a classic expression of esteem competition. I'm better than you. We are better than the Trump supporters. And here's a characteristic response, doubling down, right? Okay, Hillary calls us deplorable, so yeah, we're gonna wear that label and be proud of it. Well, that's not very constructive either. But now this leads, I think, to a really difficult problem. There is injustice. Racism exists. Unjustified hostility towards immigrants exists. How can we effectively communicate this concern without engaging in toxic, sanctimonious shaming and blaming? It seems as if objecting to injustice towards various disadvantaged groups, it might seem inherently to blame and shame people whose behavior is problematic. And hence it might seem inherently to involve placing the accuser in a morally superior position to the purportedly deplorable wrongdoer. And when one does so, that will simply inspire a kind of indignation in response to a perceived insult. How dare you call me a racist, a sexist, bigoted, or what have you? And indeed, Robin DiAngelo, whose book White Fragility documents this response in detail, argues that she counters this in her own profession, trying to promote better race relations within organizations such as firms. And of course, once people engage in this response, things can rapidly be derailed. Because what's happened here is a shift from the first order moral concern to the second order judgments of character. Instead of focusing on the problematic behavior and how harmful it is, now the discourse shifts entirely to a second order concern. Who's superior to who, who's virtuous, who's vicious. And then the discourse is all about how the people who have just been accused of behaving problematically, say, to people of color within a firm, are now rushing to defend their character, and all the discussion is about how insulting it is to be accused in this way, and how important it is to acknowledge the moral integrity of the people accused. No more discourse anymore about the original first order concern that perhaps people of color within the firm feel disparaged, discriminated against, ignored, and so forth. That just gets tossed aside while all of the discourse gets focused on these second order judgments of character. And we get virtue signaling on one side, the woke people rushing to signal their wokeness. And on the other side, the indignant response is evading the call to pay attention to the first order moral concern that initiated the conversation. If one hears every single call to concern for people of color as a personal insult to oneself, and then rises to defend one's own moral character, that self-defensive response to defend one's own person and one's own identity displaces all discussion of the first order concern and hence enables one to escape engaging the matter of the original problematic behavior that may well be unjust. So how can we communicate moral concern about injustice given this dynamic? I want to focus our attention on how the left, the woke people, often engage in two toxic inferential dynamics that make this process worse and only add fuel to the fire. So on the one hand, we could look at disagreement about facts, which is more and more common in American political discourse. The inference goes something like this: you don't believe what I believe, that vaccines are necessary to protect public health, or that global warming is a reality. So you're stupid. This inference supposes that you have the same evidence as me and evaluate it in the same way. In particular, it presupposes that you listen to and trust the same sources as I do. Well, I think that requires some questioning. And secondly, it's disagreements about values, which is also common, although according to the survey researchers, often enough, we disagree more about facts than we do about values. And the inferential dynamic that I call toxic goes something like this: you're behaving harmfully or in other ways that violate my values, so you're evil. I think we've heard this a lot. But this inference supposes that my values are obviously right and that you are intentionally violating them. Maybe that is worth some serious questioning. And now I want to introduce some important thinkers who I think have some better ways of thinking about how to talk to our fellows. I'll start off with Robin Dembroff, who has some wisdom in articulating two virtues. Dembroff narrates in What It Is Like to Be a Philosopher. Dembroff was interviewed here. It's a wonderful, wonderful, rich interview. Relates some of their background, gender nonconforming from the earliest age, in a Christian evangelical family, very, very, very conservative. Dembroff was closeted, even to themselves, until the age of 21. Ended up attending the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, majoring in philosophy, went on to earn a PhD in philosophy from Notre Dame, and is currently an assistant professor at Yale University and identifies as non-binary and goes by pronoun they, their. Dembroff, reflecting on their own autobiography, reports reflecting on this whiplash of moving from an intensely conservative fundamentalist world into a progressive academic world. And that shocking change of culture led Dembroff to realize the importance of two virtues. One virtue is epistemic humility. Here's someone who believed, seriously, fervently believed in Christian evangelism, but in college and afterwards came to reject that view that was once held dear and certain. Dembroff thought, well, if it happened to me once, it could happen again. Who knows? The virtue here is to not be so sure that one is right. don't be so sure that you know everything already about this issue. And the second virtue that Dembroff came to recognize is the importance of ideological mercy. If anything, I think this is even more important, mercy. Ideological mercy involves recognizing that everyone's opinion has an origin story. That is, some narrative, some root in one's biography that explains how the acquisition of that belief made sense at the time to the person who acquired it. Dembroff, having been raised in an intensely conservative family, deeply religious, relating only to fellow evangelicals growing up, it would only be natural that they would acquire evangelical beliefs and believe them fervently. And ideological mercy then requires that when one encounters a view, a person one disagrees with, one must understand the other's point of view before criticizing. Find out what that origin story is. Why does this view make sense to the other? And then, if you do want to persuade them otherwise, meet them where they are. Don't address them with one's own premises, which they have no reason, they haven't heard before, or they find strange. Try to start with premises that they do accept and draw them out. And avoid elitist dismissal, even of views one finds deeply, deeply wrong, and even views that, because of their wrongness, are leading to seriously harmful or unjust behavior. So this is the problem of communicating moral concern in an effective way that takes the other seriously. Here are some further things that one can do. One can testify to the consequences of behavior one thinks is harmful or unjust. Assume that the other party is ignorant of these consequences, not that they are intentionally or deliberately bringing about those consequences. One can say, I felt this harm in response to this behavior, and then articulate what one found harmful about it, or unjust or unfair about it. The importance here is testimony instead of principle. It's not, this is wrong because it violates some principle. It's testifying to one's personal experience of harm or the personal experience of others to this behavior. Paul K. Chappell, in The Art of Waging Peace, a wonderful, wonderful book on what it is to wage peace instead of war, and what that discourse involves. I strongly recommend this book. Chappell urges that we should assume that the other has a good will and is willing to change behavior in light of such testimony of harm and injustice. Don't assume the other is evil or irredeemable, as Hillary Clinton claimed. If you assume that the other is capable of moral change, that's necessary in order to elicit it. Here's another philosopher, I think, who offers some wisdom, Elise Springer, Wesleyan University, wrote a wonderful book called Communicating Moral Concern that I recommend to everyone who's interested in this issue. Springer argues that to communicate moral concern, you shouldn't at the outset assume that you know everything that is wrong or problematic about the behavior that one is concerned about. Instead, communicating moral concern involves inviting the other into a dialogue about how to understand and address those concerns. Don't assume that you even understand what's problematic. Invite the other to help shape that understanding of what's going wrong and how we might address that concern. In other words, the first step in communicating moral concern is a call to attention, to point out that there's something problematic here, not a call to engage in some specific predefined action. Instead, in giving testimony, one is essentially saying, given this perspective that I've just given you, how do you think you or we should respond? And invite them to reflect on that. And here I want to stress the importance of testimony over a predefined principle of morality or justice. Because at stake here in communicating moral concern is an invitation to the other to explore together how we might understand and address those concerns together. And that requires reciprocal attention to the other's concerns and values, not just the initial ones that sparked the conversation. It requires listening. And it requires an open dialogue to construct shared responses, leaving it open that one's own point of view will probably shift in response to this dialogue, and that the things one thought it was best to do will also change in response to the other's concerns. We can see how Dembroff's two virtues are manifest in this style of dialogue that Springer and Chappell recommend. Epistemic humility. The invitation to explore the response together does not presuppose that one already knows the answer. To the contrary, it presupposes, I don't really know exactly how we should be responding. I need your input on this. It also expresses ideological mercy, because it requires listening to the other's point of view. What's at stake here is an attempt to explore a possible fusion of horizons between oneself and the other, so that we together can move forward in coordinating a response to the concern at hand, which has been shaped then by both parties having given input to how we should respond together. And an openness also to creative articulation and re-articulation of what is the matter and what should be done about it. Here I want to stress the advantages of personal testimony over argument. Philosophers are always praising argument. We always engage in argument. Philosophers are a very argumentative bunch. But here I'm recommending that maybe we should step back a little bit from the position of argument. Argument has its own problematic features. The value of testimony is that it expresses a personal point of view. It doesn't claim to express an objective truth. It's expressing one's response to something that one finds problematic. It makes explicit its own situatedness and partiality. It doesn't presume that this is a universal truth obvious to everyone. Testimony takes the form of storytelling. I'm going to tell my story about how I felt in response to this behavior that I found problematic. And storytelling is a way to help people engage their empathy and to open up, even critically reflect on their own behavior by connecting with the responses of other people. By contrast, argument is a little bit like warfare. Analogically, it's like that. There's one side, there's another side, there's winners and losers. In argument, we hear an objection and we raise defenses to that threat from a fixed position, the thing that we think we must stand on, lest our identity dissolve. Hence, argument frequently degenerates into positional competition. There's winners and losers here. I want to be on top. I have to vanquish the enemy, the opponent, the other side. Argument starts from, at least philosophical, moral argument tends to start from abstract principles and premises, which have been articulated without the involvement of the other and need not accommodate or even acknowledge the other's identity and point of view. It's not that I'm saying that abstract principles are never necessary. I think they are sometimes necessary, but I don't think they're a starting point. They're not a good starting point for discussion of very fraught topics where people feel that their identities are at stake and where deep values differ. If these principles from which we're arguing are not already shared, they're at most tentative conclusions arrived at through dialogue that is responsible to personal experience and point of view of all the parties involved. So I think instead of starting with abstract principles as first premises, they're just tentative conclusions after we've had a dialogue exploring together what the problems are that we face together and how we might address them. So I want to end with a reflection on a wonderful essay by John Dewey. I'm not called the John Dewey University professor for nothing. Dewey is a wonderful theorist of democratic practice among citizens, and he wrote a lovely essay called Creative Democracy, The Task Before Us, in, I believe it was 1922. This is what he said. I think it's highly relevant for today's politics, our political moment today. He says, suppression of the other by ridicule and abuse is treason to the democratic way of life. He characterized a genuinely democratic faith in peace is faith in the possibility of conducting disputes, controversies, and conflicts as cooperative undertakings in which both parties learn. And learning is important. It means you don't already know what's right. We come to discover what's right by learning from each other. And we do that by giving the other a chance to express itself. Thank you.
So you're mic'd up, right? Yeah. We're going to have an open question and answer period, but I thought to just let us begin. It's been my habit to ask two people to ask initial questions, and Candace Vogler from the philosophy department right there, would you be willing to, and neither of them have heard the talk before, they're just responding to what they've heard.
Thank you. Oh, that was wonderful. So thank you very much for that talk. And there were two sorts of things that came up for me listening to you, both of which I think are in favor of your revised starting points with testimony and point of view, but they go in slightly different directions. One of the important things about testimony happens when none of us knows how to characterize what the problem is. And it's the most we seem to be able to say is that there's some differential treatment here, there's some kind of behavior or attitude, I don't even know what it is, but here's what it feels like, and I don't even know how to name it. That seems to me like one of the places where everybody can really benefit, not because the testimonial knows even how to say the thing that's gone wrong. So that was just like an initial kind of comment. And the question had to do with inviting you, I mean, it's deeply personal and interpersonal, the approach that you're describing. And it could be that all politics really starts there. I mean, that's a thing you could think. But it's very hard to imagine this approach in the larger public sphere, where it really does seem like ignorant armies clashing by night, I mean, in Matthew Arnold's phrase. So I was just wondering if you could comment both on the wonderful possibility of getting a better sense of the problem through the kind of dialogue you're imagining, and on the difficulty of trying to figure out how to scale it up for our current situation.
Yeah, it's just exactly right that you've hooked onto this precious moment of actually trying to articulate what the problem is in a way that addresses multiple points of view and multiple concerns. Those moments, that process prior to having an articulation of the problem is absolutely precious and important. And that's where trust is built. So I agree with you entirely about that, and I think it's one of the great virtues of pragmatist philosophy, that it's dwelling on that. Whereas so much philosophy assumes, so we already know the question, and it's not just in politics, but even in the philosophy of science, for instance. Okay, we've got all our evidence, and we have this hypothesis, and how does evidence relate to hypothesis? But what about the whole process of like formulating a hypothesis and figuring out like what evidence would be relevant and how we might measure it? There's millions and millions of problems that have to be solved before you even get to that point, where then, if anything, most of the problems have already been solved, right? And so, so you captured that perfectly. I think that's right. And then it really is a genuine question about how we scale it up. I agree. I think that's one of our great challenges. But in fact, there are many projects underway to do that. So I'll just tell you about one that I just heard about from the political science, Kathy Kramer, who's working with high-tech people to create technologies of communication where people can tell their stories, and it's located in public libraries. So they can go to the library, you record your stories on devices, and you can hear other people's stories, and it's all on the web, and people can comment and reflect. But again, because it's coming from the heart, it's sincere, and it's very personal, it helps people gain understanding of where the other is coming from. And it also acknowledges the contingency of that conclusion that people came to, or even it's not, maybe not even a conclusion, but just kind of like, I'm troubled by these things, right? And now that they have scaled it up, because you can go on the web and look it up, and anyone can do this. And I think it would be much more profitable for them to do that than to go on social media and start trashing people they disagree with. I mean, if you're going to spend that time, why not spend that time actually listening seriously to the other to find out where they're coming from? It's not like we don't have the time, but we're not spending it very well.
The second question I've asked Chiara Cordelli from the Political Science Department to.
So thank you for this very thought-provoking paper. In fact, so thought-provoking, my thoughts are still forming in my mind. So I guess my question is about the place of blaming and shaming in your view and in your conception of politics, and more broadly about your understanding of what political discourse counts as dysfunctional. So it was really one important premise of your talk, if I understood correctly, that political discourse counts as dysfunctional when it displaces evidence-based, problem-solving approach to political discourses. And I can see how, I mean, I agree, of course, with this qualification, but we should wonder, I think, whether the whole purpose of politics is to be simply a problem-solving enterprises, right? And if one assumes a broader understanding of politics, then one may wonder whether some of the discourse that you define as dysfunctional might actually not be dysfunctional. So I was thinking about cases like demonstrators in right-wing protests that claim, say, Jews should not replace us, or the case of you are not one of us, of Americans selling Puerto Ricans. And Here it seems to me that shaming as a response or blaming, like you are a racist, it might well displace problem-solving evidence-based discourse, but might still be an apt form of response for many reasons, because in this way we've tried to avoid normalization by reaffirming the non-negotiable nature of certain kind of basic norms. We try to frame this discourse as not an anomaly, but as part of maybe an entrenched form of racism that characterize, contemporary institutions. And also because it might be very apt, morally speaking, to feel and express resentment in that context. So I was wondering if, is necessarily blaming and shaming a dysfunctional form of political discourse, or there might be a place for it? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a great question. So in the abstract to my talk, which was publicized for this lecture, I didn't want to say that it's never appropriate to blame and shame. I think sometimes that is appropriate for behavior that is, well beyond the pale. But there's a lot of stuff which is morally problematic and may well be racist, but at a much lower level. We're not talking about Charlottesville. We're talking about just, maybe the reiteration of a derogatory racial stereotype almost automatically, or just it's taken for granted, okay? And, microaggressions of various sorts. And at that point, right, I think a different kind of discourse is appropriate. But even for hardcore racists, I think it's important, actually, and this is very difficult work, so not everyone can do it, but some people are brave enough to do this. I really do think it's important to recognize that, not to think that even people who are engaging in really toxic behavior are irredeemable. They're not. People are redeemable. And in fact, we do have very interesting examples of very brave people, and I don't recommend this for everyone. You have to be really brave to do it, of approaching KKK people and other, even ISIS people, and engaging them and asking them, like, what's going on in their lives. And one of the things we find is that there's enormous amounts of fear there. And shame doesn't really disarm fear. Shaming people doesn't, blaming people doesn't. You really got to get at the fear. And there are ways to disarm that and to move people away from identities that they think are helping them, even in fact they're getting psychologically all twisted up by trumped up fears of various sorts.
Questions? Anyone? Please, first.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was curious about the term toxic, which just occurred again with toxic behaviors of, engaging in discussion with people who might be very extreme. And you mentioned ISIS or, very KKK. And so what came to mind was like, oh my God, maybe it's a really extreme leftist liberal. But, that person could be very scary for someone who's very far on the right-hand side of politics in the United States. So another time that you used the term toxic was too toxic inferential dynamics. So I was trying to envision what would be another set of terms than toxic. So is it beneficial? Is it, organic, but at any rate, I wondered if you could explore the sense of toxic, because it seems to be a term that's very embedded and almost taken for granted as something that we should have almost a knee-jerk anxiety about, which I don't disagree with, but it seems to be embedded in, for example, environmental discourse. So how is that analogy functioning for you in relationship to civil society, for example? What baggage comes with that term?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And here I'm thinking metaphorically that certain kinds of discourse are toxic to the body, to the democratic body politic, right? That is, that it prevents the functioning of truly democratic discourse where democracy does take as a background assumption that fellow citizens are equals and reachable, not irredeemable. That's why Dewey talks about a democratic faith, that the other side, those other people, are not the problem. If you start thinking that it's those other people that are the problem, you have, as opposed to problems that we face together, if you start thinking in terms of politics as a matter of discovering and the enemies within and punishing or marginalizing them, that's not a space in which democratic politics can operate. That's a space in which authoritarian politics operates. So when I talk about toxic discourse, I'm talking about discourse that is poisonous to the democratic civil society.
Your hand was up, but you still want to speak? No, over there. Yeah, did you have your hand up? I didn't.
Hello, thank you so much first for your talk. One question that I had while you were answering her question about what is apt, what is considered an apt response to things that are aggressive and things that are necessarily damaging, like they can be immediately damaging within a society, such as a racism that could hurt someone like very easily. What I was curious about is how you believe, or whether you think this framework requires that both interlocutors utilize this framework and utilize this method of dialogue in order to create progress, or in order for some kind of change to be enacted. Whether both speakers, both people in the dialogue and both people in the communication have to approach or engage in this necessarily in order for it to function.
Yeah, I do conceive of this as a dialogic process, and it does mean that, look, I don't say that everyone must always be engaging with others, because others could be like really scary people, and so in some cases, right, only certain people can be even asked to do this because of the costs, that they're better able to withstand the costs. But yes, we all have to be listening to each other. And I think it's important here, I think it's almost impossible to exaggerate the degree to which fear is an underlying emotion behind racism. And I think getting that insight, fear much more than hatred. In fact, hatred is a derivative emotion from fear. And to recognize that the other side that is behaving so aggressively, that's a fear response, fight or flight, and they've chosen fight. It helps you see that the other is actually vulnerable. and that's an opening. And that's what can be worked on. But again, you can't ask everyone to engage everyone, right? I mean, you have to pick your dialogue partners, but among those partners have to be people who you disagree with, not just speaking to like-minded.
You're next, and then there. And oh, good. I've been geographical diversity in terms of the audience. Good. All the questions have come from these three rows. I'm supposed to move out. So, okay, good. Please.
So you have equivalency between group of people that support by alternative facts and group of people who have the real facts.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Alternative facts, some group of people, Trump supporters, they believe to alternative facts. Alternative facts, it means that it's not true, but we believe it. For example, global warming not exist. Let's negotiate now. I think that global warming exists, you think it's not. Instead of saying you just don't understand, I should negotiate with you. Maybe in the end of the day, I would not believe in global warming. We have equal chance to change our mind. So this group of Trump supporters, for 3 years, watch what's going on, and it doesn't change. It's 40% was before and 40% now. What it tells us? That we cannot negotiate with them at all. It does not work. These people believe in some alternative facts or some myths or some tales that just not true. It's not existent. And now it's book was published that Trump is just head of some cult, analogous to other cults. And if it's really true, your theory that we need to negotiate in faith with them, it's not true. You cannot negotiate with people who say there is no gravitation. I know that gravitation is, you know, you're saying it's not. What we negotiate about?
Good, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so this is just one lecture of 3 that I gave at Oxford University a few weeks ago. And what you're focusing on is disagreement about facts. This lecture is really mostly about disagreement about moral values. But you're right. If anything, I think disagreement about facts, like does global warming exist, are vaccines effective and helpful for public health, and things like that. In fact, the polling these days shows that disagreement about facts is even wider than disagreement about values. But if I had time, I would give you my second lecture, which was all about disagreement about facts. But one thing I want to point out is that we're not talking here about negotiation, because negotiation already presupposes that I know my interests and you know your interests, and maybe we could split the difference or something like that. That's not really what's at stake when we're trying to actually converge on facts, or at least on behaviors, on policies. But if you want to know how to approach things like climate change, there are really interesting research that's been done by this, and I recommend that you take a look, just for starters, at the cultural cognition research program led by Yale University law professor Dan Kahan, who's done some wonderful research on how to effectively engage people whose identities are staked in denial of the reality of climate change. And one of the things that he's found is that there are certain trigger words, like climate change and global warming, that make people feel, largely Republicans, but not only. In fact, he has a different way of sort of dividing up American ideological positions. It's not specifically partisan. Make them feel threatened. Those words make them feel threatened and insulted. But there are other ways of talking about it. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk in Dallas, Texas, and people down there, they talk about fluky weather. Okay, and it's okay to talk about fluky weather, right? In fact, when I was there, they had just recently experienced massive, unusual flooding, which had shaken the very thin soil and dislodged natural gas pipes that led to houses being exploded, that literally exploding. In fact, my host at Southern Methodist University had to rush home to protect his home from being exploded. So it's not as if people are unaware that the climate is changing. Indeed, talk to any farmer in America. There's nobody who knows more about how things are changing climate-wise than farmers, because their entire livelihood depends on it. They don't like certain ways of talking about it, but indeed, as Kahan shows, there are other ways of talking about these problems that very conservative people can hear and address. And Kahan has shown this not only in experiment, but in actual political discourse. So I recommend that you look at his website. But yeah, things can be done.
Questions over here, please. Yep.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about this, but I'm going to try to take a page out of your book about testimony, because I have many arguments, but I think one piece of testimony I can offer is, as a person of color, and as a woman, as a queer person, and I think a lot of people in marginalized positions will testify that this reaction that you're describing, that's captured by the book White Fragility, moves regardless of what you say. It's not a function of what the marginalized person said that is then responded to in a particular way, or like how we say it. That's like saying a survivor of sexual assault should have framed her rape accusation differently, and that's why people are responding. People are responding to the content of what you're saying, regardless of the way that you're saying it, which is, and as you said, the idea of racism coming from fear, well, what is that fear of? It's of losing a position of power, and power is really missing from your presentation. When did John Dewey write, and what was the state of Black America when he was writing it? I mean, this idea of like democracy built on equal citizenship is in itself a falsity. Like that's a farce. That's never existed in American history, and probably will never exist. And so to me, I want to see what the position, where power falls into any of this. You're assuming people with equal levels of power, and you're assuming that what everyone is saying is being taken at face value. In reality, that's just not true.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I do want to point out that Dewey was a member of the NAACP. In fact, one of the earliest members. He was vividly aware of the realities of racial inequality in the United States, spoke against it. Democracy is an ideal. I'm not claiming that it exists fully formed. It's always a work in progress. And the question is how to make it real. Okay, and the point is that we do have powerful examples. Indeed, Paul K. Chappell, who I quoted here, is Black, and his hero, one of his heroes, is Martin Luther King Jr., who he extols as a practitioner of peaceful dialogue, which did, in fact, change people. Real change happened. It doesn't mean perfection, far from it. But it created change. And I know you're shaking your head, but you weren't there. I actually was alive when Jim Crow was around, okay, and saw it. Things have changed, okay? It doesn't, of course injustice happens. It still exists, it's deeply entrenched. And we're actually seeing backsliding right now, absolutely. But it doesn't mean that these responses are fixed and forever. If we can change once, we can change again. But let us draw some lessons from how King did it and the whole civil rights movement. It wasn't about mass denunciation.
Power. Yeah, thank you. But I'd like to give other people, and Ben, do you want to do? Sure.
Yeah. In a way, I want to pick up themes that have emerged in several questions, including just the prior question. And here's my worry about your talk. I think you say things that are true, and that, but you're giving them a kind of significance that I wonder about. The reason is this: the context that we're thinking about are political things, where our analysis of what we're to do always involves consideration of time frames in which to act, always involves analysis of a situation, what are the causes, which people are conversation partners that we can move in a given time, which aren't. Those will have to do with facts about organized power, they'll have to do with all kinds of other facts, but if I'm organizing against domination in the workplace of one kind or another, probably the last people I should talk to right now are the people at the Chamber of Commerce. They've got an analysis, I'm not going to move them. It would change everything if I could, but that's not the way to go. Instead, I should talk to the workers and do this and do that and so on. And so I feel like, the prior question of who the conversation partners are is just of extreme importance, and it affects the question, also of who's wronging and who's being wronged in complicated ways can be, tied into that analysis. And so, just would you speak to that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, it was important the civil rights movement was a cross-racial movement. I think it's absolutely vital and indispensable. And similarly, if we're looking at problems in the workplace, any viable solution to reviving the labor movement has to be multiracial. And that means you have to deal with, well, frankly, racist white workers who have found a source of privilege in excluding people of color. But that has to be engaged because there's no victory for labor without engaging white workers. And I'm not saying that of course you need organization, mobilization, and so forth, but what I want to get us away from is the thought that all we have to do is mobilize our side, our people, to defeat the other side, and then everything will be good. Because that's not how things happen. Even the process of affecting change requires engaging the other. It's not just about, you just don't win once and for all and totally vanquish the enemy and then say you've achieved victory. That didn't happen in the Civil War. And if it didn't happen there at the cost of mass bloodshed, it's certainly not going to happen now. That's why I think just mobilizing one's own side to defeat the other in the next election or the next policy fight, it doesn't actually yield what's needed.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll have a reception right outside. So, and I'll also say I'm going to make sure Elizabeth Anderson comes straight outside so that she's not corralled here while everybody is waiting to talk to her. We'll go outside. But I saw your hand next, so why don't, yes, would you, could you bring the mic over?
Okay, thank you. So I just want to go back to the two questions ago, because I think it's really important, this idea of power. So we're talking a lot here about discourse, and I think it's so important, the things that you've raised. But I think there's a sort of something that's being forgotten, which is that when it comes to issues of power, speech is also a kind of action. Right, and it can be very consequential action, and frightening consequences can arise from the normalization of certain kinds of speech. So I just wanted to invite you to comment on something in my country, which is the Incitement to Religious and Racial Hatred Act of 2006, which is quite controversial, where basically ordinary citizens can be prosecuted for certain kinds of speech, for saying certain kinds of things about people, members of racial and religious minorities. This was incredibly controversial because it goes against freedom of expression, but I think it raises a really important point about power, because one of the reasons that this act is in place is because if you allow ordinary citizens to say certain kinds of things about Muslims, for example, right, which is one example that you used, then you really do, I mean, you know, slippery slope arguments are so annoying, but you really do have this possibility of the accumulation of very dangerous ideologies. And I think we're kind of seeing that today. I think that, you know, maybe what you're saying is right, that this is the way to bring it about, but I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about different ways of engaging through incitement to religious and racial hatred act is like sort of cutting off a certain kind of speech and saying, no, we're not going to allow that, as opposed to a very, very different position that you're taking here, which is let's engage it, let's assume best intentions. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily assuming best intentions, it's assuming a capacity to recognize the good, which is different from assuming that they already have the best of intentions. So I do wonder somewhat about the use of the criminal law in this. you know, people who are already resentful about these others find themselves criminally punished for saying stuff that within their social circles is like conventional wisdom. It doesn't strike me, then they'll feel like, oh, I'm just being censored and this is all part of the whole conspiracy against people like me. I think there are better ways than engaging this through the use of the criminal law. Certainly in a US context, we imprison vastly too many people. I wouldn't want to see even more calls for criminal justice as the principal tool we use to deal with problematic behavior. And that's what I'm suggesting here is a reconstruction of civil society. One of Dewey's great themes is laws alone do not make a democracy work. It's super, super important. Democracy is about a certain kind of civic culture that citizens conduct with each other. And that's what I'm trying to bring out here is a different way to deal with this behavior.
Please join me in thanking Elizabeth Anderson for her talk.